Well, hi again, and welcome to Coffee with Craig. I'm Craig Hamilton Parker. I'm a psychic medium, and I talk about the future and try to give us some ideas about things that are happening in the future and share with you my ideas of spirituality and some of my interest in Eastern mysticism and so forth. Well, I want to share with you today some ideas about mediumship. Now, mediumship's communication with the spirit world. And mediumship originates out of spiritualism, mainly here in Western cultures. And I want to share with you some of the ideas that other mediums have spoken about the future of the world, how these compare to what myself and other mediums today are saying, and can they give us some insight into the way the world is heading? Did they see right back in those early days the problems we have today? And can they give us deeper insight into what's happening now? So that's the theme for today. We're going to talk about the future as seen through the eyes of the dead. Through the eyes of the dead. Now, don't forget, guys, if you're here for the first time, please again subscribe and give us a thumbs up every time you come to the video. If you don't mind, guys, if you like following me, because it does help a great deal to keep this channel bouncing along on the algorithm properly. Anyway, I'd like to talk today about some ideas about mediumship and how that influences my work. And has influenced other mediums, and what some of those have had to say about the future. Because sometimes people come to me and say, oh, Craig, you said such and such and so and so. You know, I see it in the comments, these type of things. You said such and such and so, but another medium said this, and this. So if you're all mediums, why aren't you all saying the same thing? Which is a good logical question in many ways. But of course, I can't account for other mediums, and it's exactly the same with the mediums of the past now that I'm going to talk about. Some of them were spot on. Some of them, I think, might have had a few dubious backgrounds to them. And I've met mediums today who I certainly wouldn't recommend to anybody. So who knows who's getting the truth? But I think when we look at all the mediums, we might be able to pick up a few ideas about what they're also saying about the future, just as I am too. And with all of these things, you have to always judge the truth of mediumship through your own personal experience. If you've seen really good mediums or you've watched good mediums, and particularly when you've got a personal message that nobody could sort of have possibly pulled out of nothing without either having done research on you, which would have been impossible, hopefully, in the situations that you were in, and could not have just given you vague guesswork that could apply to anybody. When you get a really specific message from the spirit world, it can be quite earth-shattering, can't it? Actually, if you've had any messages like that, put them in the comments below. Not necessarily always ones from me, but, you know, other mediums. It's really quite fascinating when you get a proof. What proof did you get? And this is how we should judge mediumship, from our own personal experience. But there has, of course, been lots of mediums in the past who have had some insights into the spirit world, given very good what we call evidence and proof. And some of the early mediums are saying similar things sometimes to what the mediums today are saying. Let me take a few of them, for example. There's Andrew Jackson Davies. He's an American medium, going back way back 1826. He was born, and he lived to about 1910, just before the First World War sort of time. And he was seen as a seer and one of a very influential medium in his time. And he was picked up particularly by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who you always think about as writing the Sherlock Holmes books, but Conan Doyle was deeply involved in spiritualism, for those of you who are kind of new to it. He wrote a lot about Andrew Jackson Davies, who wrote a book. Andrew Jackson Davies, Conan Doyle's book is The History of Spiritualism, well worth reading. There's a number of others that he's written as well. But Jackson Davies wrote a book called, I think it was called The New Age of Harmony. And he spoke right back then about big, huge scientific advances, particularly in medicine and in social revolutions. They say he predicted anesthetics and modern hospitals and how they would work. And he had quite a interesting views of the future. He said in his time, which was a very religious type of time, that the future would see a decline of orthodox religion. And of course, that did happen. There was the birth of new spiritual philosophy, the New Age movement, where people kind of look for themselves rather than go to traditional religion. So he was onto something there, I think. An aspect that I feel is going to increase in the future, in the years ahead. I have said that I see in the future and in the near future a major rebirth of traditional religion for a while, particularly as a kind of a movement in Christianity. This would be a counter to what's been happening with Islam. So I see that's going to become, I spoke about it last year, actually, that it would be an aspect of this year's predictions, which it has, of course, because now you see many of the protests going on in the UK and in Europe carrying crosses and things like this. So there's kind of a burst onto the scene of traditional Christianity. I see that for a while. But eventually, these things, which are kind of politically driven at the moment, will give way to the growing social revolution that is kind of a more spiritual philosophy type of religion, a universality to religion, which is something that spiritualism spoke about a lot, of the idea of there being a universal religion. It liked to see itself as a bridge between religions, that the idea that mediums could communicate with the next world was something that all religions could embrace. And of course, there was many conflicts to this and challenges to this, although even the Archbishop of Canterbury at one point, who was Cosmo Lang at his time, felt that spiritualism was actually a safe thing and should be adopted into Christian teachings generally. But then that was rejected. I'm packing too much in here. But, so that even right back then at the time of Andrew Jackson Davies, there was talk about a change spiritually in the world. We had other mediums, the Bang sisters come to mind, who were a little bit, I'm not quite sure of them in many ways. In some of the stuff, there was a lot of stuff that seemed to have been debunked genuinely from the Bang sisters, but they used to produce spirit paintings and messages from the Ascended Masters idea about world peace and scientific invention being the massive progress. None of them actually mentioned, as far as I can see when I've looked through, any hints at artificial intelligence. I will say that I saw a medium once, because you can't see for yourself. I'm a medium. If I see for myself, I can't always see for myself because I get ideas and things, but I might be blinding myself with my own thoughts and expectations. So sometimes we go and see another medium. And I saw a medium, and just an ordinary medium. He was not well known or anything like that, who gave me a message in the past about going right back into the 1980s, this would be. I was saying, I see lots of people looking in screens all around the world at you, Craig, but these aren't television screens. These are screens, and you're talking back to them. So he was predicting not only the internet there, but was also predicting things like Zoom and Skype, which was way out of way. That hadn't been invented at that time, which was interesting. So I think the mediums have seen that, but I couldn't see anything in the Bang sisters. But they did talk about the invention of radio, which they were way before that. They were in the late 19th century. And also they talked about etheric communication, I think it was, they saw technologies that would bridge worlds, they spoke about. Now, what they were meaning there was talking about some form of technology that could build between this world and the next. Now, there were people like Edison and also Tesla, I think, also thought about, could we ever build a machine that could communicate with the dead? So were they seeing something like that? Were they seeing something that maybe AI could one day communicate with the dead? I mean, we're at very early stages, and like with by Craig's Oracle that some of you have been using, as I say, it can't communicate with the dead. We're certainly not at this stage. Whether 10 years in the future things that might start to change, who knows? But certainly at the moment, it's not a medium as such. It's a program. But who knows where that could go? Were even those mediums there seeing something like this? And then we come back to the sort of post-war mediums. There were after the two world wars, there was a great interest when people lost many of their loved ones in the trenches in the First World War and in the Second World War. There was a big boom in people's interest in spiritualism because so many people had died young, you see. And a number of mediums came to the fore. One that comes to mind is Eileen Garrett, who was a very interesting medium. She had a spirit control. Ovania or something like that, some strange name was the name of the spirit guide that would overshadow her. And during that time, there was a lot of trance mediumship happening. And she often made comments in some of her readings. They were written down by they were scribbled down by a stenographer. They didn't have recordings of these most of the time, but she talked a lot about the fate of nations and the coming atomic age. She's talking in the she died in 1970, but she was born in 1893, so she was quite an old lady by the time but she was doing these things throughout her trance, and she talked about changes in the human evolution, that the human evolution would change. I mean, that's something also that Helena Blavatsky spoke about. She was not a spiritualist, but she was like a theosophist, and talked about the different racial groups or spiritual groups of humanity, that humanity actually went through these huge evolutionary shifts and changes, and different beings had ruled the earth over different periods. I mean, this is going off on a whole new trek here. But I think it's quite interesting that that people like Eileen Garrett and things were talking about the changing of human evolution. As something that I also have spoken about before, because as we move forward, I've talked about this as an idea, how would we physically and spiritually change? Now, I've spoken to many Siddha yogis who have miraculous powers. I've been to see Sathya Sai Baba, who could materialize things, and I saw him materialize Vibhuti ash only feet away from me, and to me that was no trick. And I've seen and heard and talked to stories of people who've often met mediums and also met highly spiritually evolved people who just produce phenomena around them, and some of it's questionable. It's got to be questioned. You've got to put pretty strong criteria on this to test it in many ways. But from your personal experience, what do you see? And is there any possibility of trickery with these things? But I've seen incredible stuff, and it makes me think, well, what can human beings actually evolve to? I mean, are we capable of changing the reality around us? If we can materialize something, well, can we not change the world? And have we got a different view of the world in the future? You see, at the moment, I think these early spiritualists that I'm talking about here had a comparatively flat earth view of the world in many ways. They were still living in a very materialistic age in many respects, with very limited understandings of the nature of reality. I think India had a different view, but nowadays we start to see reality in a very different way. We think about multiverses, don't we? And we think about quantum theory and what is real and what is consciousness, things that they'd only started to think about in those age and probably couldn't grasp. We need to question it. What is the spirit world? Is it a multiverse? Is it any physical type of form to it, or is it in that quantum field somewhere? Is it some other form of vibration? And of course, even ask the question, what is the self, and does anything actually exist other than pure consciousness behind our form? So there were some interesting ideas. I mean, another one that comes to mind, I've actually put a list of mediums I can talk about in front of me. I might go through them all. But Estelle Roberts was another interesting medium. She lived also to 1970. And she had a spirit guide called Red Cloud, who often made predictions about the future. That Red Cloud talked about a world cleansing. Now, was that talking about this is coming after the Second World War, So, what is this world cleansing that would awaken humanity spiritually? Could that mean a cleansing of humanity? Could it mean races being destroyed? Could it mean nuclear wars and things like that? She talked a lot about the rise and fall of nations and the return of spiritual healing to the world. And many of some of Red Cloud's wartime addresses, which was, obviously prior to the post-war stuff, said that there were prophetic elements in there about peace and negotiations in the world and world change. But was this coming from a natural optimism of her about coming out of the Second World War, that we will have, out of that came the League of Nations and things like this, and there's great hope in the world that we could change things. But, are we now heading towards the same problems again? Now, I did ask this question to my mediumistic teacher, who was called Peter Close, and Bill Landis also worked with him, but Peter Close was my main teacher. He'd been trained by Ivy Northridge, another well-known spiritualist medium in their time, and I used to ask his guide when he was in trance. He had a guide called Rama come through, and I used to give him quite a hard time about the future of the world. And Rama said to me, and I've mentioned this before, that we wouldn't destroy ourselves with nuclear bombs, but he said coming up, and this is talking again in the 1980s, earlier 1980s, 83 or something like that. He was saying coming up in the future soon, we're going to see big conflicts between Iran and Iraq, that people could almost bring the world to a nuclear crisis, and there will be a rise of nations like North Korea, he said, that would have nuclear bombs. Now, at that time, no chance would North Korea have ever had a nuclear bomb. And, the conflict between the Iran-Iranian war went on for years before he said this, which did bring the world quite a lot to crisis, because, 9/11 came out of this and things like that. But the reassuring message was from that particular trance communication, was that the world we'd have to watch the small nations of the world getting nuclear bombs, because that will be one of the big threats of the world. A threat we've got over now, hopefully, with the strike against Iran. But it would not result in a nuclear wasteland type of war of the sorts we've described within, the Cuban Missile Crisis and things like that. So that was quite interesting as well, really, and how it compares in many ways to some of the ideas that I've put forward to you here. I'm always a bit suspect of some trance mediumship, because as well as seeing good trance mediumship, which Peter Close did, I've also seen trashy mediumship and trance mediumship, and people speaking silly languages from aliens and things like that, that frankly is just ridiculous. And I've seen definitely things of people that I think have got mental illness doing trance mediumship. So, as I always say with all these things, you've got to go from your experience, go and meet mediums, and be prepared to say, the emperor has no clothes, this is nonsense, and walk away from it. And I've seen outright cheats as well with physical mediumship that really made Jane and me very, very angry when we saw this. And this is going back sometime. So, you've got to judge things, you've got to be cautious about things, and you've got to understand also that mediums are fallible. I'm fallible. I get things right, but I get things wrong sometimes. I keep telling you that. A lot of arrogant mediums say, I never get it right. Spirit's always right. I always get it right. No, bloody nonsense. There's a lot of arrogance that goes with mediumships. Patanjali, the great Indian teacher that pre-yoga, told us that you've got to be very careful of developing psychic skills, because they can be a distraction from the path to enlightenment, because they can easily get the ego involved. So this is always a danger. But there were other mediums who used to produce phenomena, as it were. One of which who was very famous within spiritualism was Gordon Higginson. He died in 1993, and I had the good fortune to meet him a number of times and speak to him a number of times and witness his incredible mediumship a number of times, in which he would go to people. There's a few videos out there on him, but they hardly touch what he was capable of, because I've seen him in an audience go to people, tell them the money they got in their pocket in loose change. Exactly. They're opened their driving license and given the number of their driving license and things like this. It was incredible. The level that he could do, never tested by the skeptics, but then I don't think these things work under skepticism, because I think the energy of the skeptics break it somehow, but that's another discussion. But he was one of Britain's most respected mediums and a president of the Spiritualist National Union, the SNU, who incidentally don't really believe in the idea that the spirit world can give us prophecies of the future, I would say. So as president of the SNU, he would have probably stood by the idea that you don't predict the future. In spiritualism, we weren't allowed to give future predictions. We might be able to give some good news from the spirit world. That's how Gordon Higginson used to speak. I have some good news here from the spirit world. This will get better. You know, he speak like that, you know. But the actual idea of prediction within spiritualism has been a bit of a conflict of debates between mediums. But I've changed. The camera blips there. I've changed my view on this a lot, because I have experienced the things in India with the Naadi oracles, and although some spiritualists have had influence in the in India, particularly the Theosophists, which are different from the spiritualism, and spiritism has also gone into that. There's so much here that you can learn about, but I'm trying to give you a little bit of a brief outline of some of the main leading spiritualists, as it were, here. But so they believe in the idea that one of the 7 principles is we have personal responsibility. Now, if we have personal responsibility, that means in order to have that, we have to have free will. And therefore, if we have free will, therefore the future is not determined. And there was another medium called Britain. Her name was Eileen Britton. What was her first name? I've forgotten now. But she brought out a set of principles, and then another set of principles that eventually became the 7 principles of spiritualism, given by the spirit world through her spirit guide. And on one that they changed, but the one of them that settled and was there from the start was the idea of personal responsibility. But Gordon Higginson, he used to materialize things. I've never seen him do a materialization where he actually, a figure will appear in the room. But some of my very close friends who I knew very, very well had sat with him in a darkened room and seen, and this one particular mediumistic friend of mine saw her mother appear in the room. And she said to me, nobody can fake up my mother. I saw my mother as clear as day rise out of the ectoplasm in the room. So these mediums were doing some incredible things. And I'm sure could not hoodwink one of my best friends into thinking she saw her mother when she didn't, because she said all the mannerisms, all the face, everything was right. And his guide, he had a number of guides. I think one was called Light. One of his guides was called Light, who gave messages about the spiritualist movement itself and how it would develop in the future. And some witnesses claimed Gordon Higginson's sittings included messages of global change, positive global change, that the world would come out of the difficulties, on the darkness of the years we're living in, and that the ideas of spiritualism would be spread worldwide. Now, that's happening. I'm talking to you now about spiritualism and talking to people in countries that probably never heard of spiritualism, although spiritualism, it's said, I have to say, at the moment, it is deteriorating to the point that it's losing its grip of itself as a movement. But its ideas certainly are progressing. I hope spiritualism will be able to survive. It's struggling hard in a world where we watch everything on screens. Who wants to go to a spiritualist church on a cold Sunday evening and listen to a medium, often who are not of the highest caliber? But, you know, things may change. Hopefully it'll go online like we're doing here. And I can't go on without also mentioning a medium called Leslie Flint, who was another brilliant medium, a direct voice medium this time. Now, what happens with the direct voice medium? And again, I'd never sat with Leslie Flint. He died in 1994. I do know people who have sat with him. And what used to happen with him is you would actually hear the voice in the room. But the thing is, it would not be coming from him. They were using darkened rooms. One of his books was called Voices in the Dark. Worth a read. It's still published. But the voice would appear in the room, around you. It would appear on the ceiling, and then it would appear behind you, and in front of you, and to the side of you, right next to your ear, and then somewhere else. And this was this ventriloquism. I think it's unlikely from the way people described it and the way the voice changed and often would mimic people they knew or was the voice of people they knew in their tone. And he had messages come through, and he had all sorts of, then it starts to make you question sometimes when great famous people come through, but he had spirits like Winston Churchill come through, and Oscar Wilde and others, to discuss the future of the world, and talked about the afterlife's growing influence on Earth, and that in days to come, the people in the spirit world would have a greater influence on the world here today, that the veil between the two worlds would become thinner. And some of the spirit speakers from the seances could actually speak much more directly to people, i.e. mediumship would become much more common in the future. Wouldn't just be for the few mediums, but more and more people would open to the idea that we can have influences and hear the voices and feel and see and sense the spirit people by us. And they talk, and Leslie Flint also spoke about an age of awareness coming in the future. This is as he described as a shift of consciousness after times of war and environmental crisis, I would add, because he did speak as well about environmental crisis. My mediumistic friend, early on mediums, spirit messages that came through Peter Close and other mediums when I was first starting out on the path to mediumship, also spoke about a dangerous environmental crisis ahead. Again, we're talking about 1980s from my early experiences with the first stepping into mediumship, but they knew about this before it was even on the news or even spoken about much. There was talk about it going back in the 60s and things, and 70s. People were talking about the dangers to the environment, but no way was it as big a thing now. And the spirit guides did talk about that quite a lot. So could it be that the mediums of the past are saying another thing about the future here, that we will have an environmental crisis? I know we're questioning some of the political misuse of environmental talk, perhaps we've had a lot of lies about it, and there's a lot of political desire now to get rid of windmills and things like this. But that doesn't mean the environmental crisis has gone away. The way we handle it, just going on a bit here, but my attitude towards that is we've made the silly mistake of saying, okay, we'll all have windmills, and then we'll let China pollute for us, and meanwhile let them grow in power while we become weak in Europe. So that was a mistake, I think. But it doesn't mean to say that environmental issues have gone away. We still have that, but we've got to get through the hoax bit and find the truth of it. But that is an issue. But there will be a shift of consciousness. So a lot of other media, there have been some mediums that have spoken about a coming of great beings that come back into the world, and teachers. We'll see that often in some of the prophetic mediums of modern times. Arthur Ford was another great medium that comes to mind here, who communicated through someone called Fletcher, I think, used to talk through him, gave messages about world transformation. Arthur Ford actually wanted to meet Yogananda, the Paramananda Yogananda, and it all fell through. Yogananda didn't feel that he wanted to communicate with Ford. He didn't feel he was on the right path. Which is interesting, because the great teachers, of course, have often sometimes contradicted mediums. So what I say is everybody's on different levels. We've got to look at this and say, they don't, because one says it doesn't mean it's true. We have to look at the broader picture of this. Another one is the Seth material, some of you might find very interesting. She wasn't a spiritualist, Jane Roberts, who wrote these, but she continued the lineage of these ideas of spirit-inspired insights, and was obviously influenced by spiritualism because she used to do trance particularly. But she predicted, again, humanity's awakening. The new age, the golden age, is not so much about just having a happy world where we can all have cocktails in the sun. No, it's more about an awakening of humanity. And this is also something, again, because the idea of waking up comes through so many others. I mean, going back to a Theosophical Society, Madame Blavatsky and people, they talked about enlightened adepts coming to the world, people that are based originally in Tibet and India, who formed this sort of brotherhood of light that was guiding the world, and that eventually we would indeed be more in touch with them, not just individuals, but collectively, humanity's way. It was Henry Occult was also Olcott, I'll pronounce his name. Henry Olcott was also involved in this with her and became a Buddhist. And actually, they championed Eastern spirituality here in the UK and around the world, and generally in Europe and America, because they started to show how, you know, we can learn from this. You know, I mean, a lot of mediums still today, like me, I mean, I'm very influenced, and my ideas have been changed by my encounters with people like Satya Sai Baba, my encounters with the Naadi oracles, my encounters with the Siddha yogis that I met in India. It completely changed my view of things. And yet I still understand that the spirit world are also helping with this. You know, it works on many, many levels. Other medium that comes to mind is Annie Besant. She died in 1933. She was born in 1847. So she's going back at the time to people like Gurdjieff and people like that were around at that time, and the Theosophists, particularly the British Theosophists. And she embraced some of the ideas of the Hindu philosophy very strongly, and even adopted Indian dress and lifestyle in her time. And she was also helped to revive Hinduism and some of the ideas. And from that, the ideas of new golden ages, the changes of the yugas, the changes of the ages, and that within different teachings say we're changing out of Kali Yugas. Others say that within Kali Yuga, there's a golden age embedded upon it. And so there was a lot of other, mediums that were very influenced by Eastern ideas in a similar way to I was. Ledbetter was, for example. Alice Bailey was. Edgar Cayce was. And all of these came together, particularly under the umbrella of some of the great teachers, and particularly Yogananda, who brought many Western students together, but also showed how the spirit world was part of this whole philosophy. I mean, he talks about how he saw his own guru materialize after he died. So, bring it all together with people like Conan Doyle, Eileen Garrett, and people like that, and Paul Brunton, who went to India and explored the Indian ideas and also spoke about the future as being kind of a positive thing. I mean, and when you take all of these together, and there's others I haven't even started on, really, like Grace Cook with her guide, White Eagle, who's near us. There's in Liss near Portsmouth. There's a centre there still for her and her mediumship, and they all talk about a coming age of harmony, a coming age of enlightenment. To a man and to a woman, they seem to all be talking about this. Most of them have this common denominator that, we're going to go through all these difficult periods of cleansing and wars and environmental crisis. And Casey and people said there'd be all sorts of earthquakes and things like that as we move forward. But the key is the root to the happiness lies in our awakening, us becoming enlightened beings. And as I said, this doesn't happen all at once. This isn't some great awakening that comes from the sky. It seems to suggest that this is something that happens to each of us individually, that we all gradually start to wake up. And as we do that, the veil between this world and the world of the dead, as it were, as the spirit world, becomes much thinner. And we begin to understand the greater purpose of human life, not just that life here on earth is the be all and end all of something. We go on into the spirit world, and then we have to look even deeper beyond that, beyond some of the early ideas of the spiritualists that I think were limited in many ways, and start to understand our place as cosmic beings, as evolving beings that can go beyond not just this world, not just the afterlife world, but can expand into ever greater consciousness, to embrace the whole multiverse, to understand the whole of existence, to understand both ourselves in this world of creation and also in the uncreated world of the great godlike divinity of our true inner self, the enlightened state, the infinite light of love and consciousness. All of that is there within us. And that's, again, what the spirit world is struggling towards and trying to help us towards. We're all helping each other up the ladder towards greater consciousness. So the answers, people often say to me, Craig, when are you going to say something happy and good in your predictions? Well, point them to this video, because ultimately we can go through all the troubles of the world. We can worry about all those things that are all out there. But ultimately, what we've got to come back to is ourselves, our inner truth, our inner light, that part within us. And when we're connected with that, you know, we don't have to wait 1,000 years or 100 years or 50 years for the great awakening to come. It can come right now, here and now, in ourselves. We'll wake up one at a time. It doesn't matter if the world is in chaos. We can still be very happy within ourselves if we find ourselves focused, stable, at one with that inner light, that inner truth. And then all the messages from all the mediums and all of this planet, all the levels of existence, from the spirit world, from the astral worlds, from the Naga worlds, through the worlds of other planets and universes, is here and now, right now, centered in ourselves. That's where the truth lies. That's where true happiness can be found. And that's where the golden age is starting right now, for you, for me, for all of us. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening to that slightly different direction today with my talk, but I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, see you soon. Bye for now. So if you'd like to go deeper into my work, you might enjoy my books. These are real books, not written by AI. They're written by me, published by top publishers such as Penguin and Barnes and Noble and so forth. And they're now all available on Amazon. You can explore my prophecies. We can look at the Naadi oracles in India. You can dive deep into the questions of life after death and what happens after we die. We look into spiritualism in my books. And also I've got books out there about how to develop your own psychic and mediumistic gifts. Now, I also in the books share my personal stories about my life as a medium. I talk about our psychic family, how I met Jane, and my work in spiritualism, and also my journeys to remote parts of India in search of ancient wisdom and the Naadi oracles and so forth. So if you like dream interpretation, I had a number of best-selling books on this, and they're now in one complete compendium volume, so you can understand your dreams, interpret them, and get a deeper spiritual insight into yourself through your dreams. So if you'd like inspiration, you'd like knowledge, and you'd like a good read and a bit of humor sometimes and some silly stories as well, have a look at the links below.